Hello and welcome to Bloop Radio. I am your host Mia Harrison, and today you're going to be witnessing the first episode of our History Archives. During the show, we're going to be talking about the nostalgia and behind the club scene and discussing the DNA of club culture and electronic history, which is something that should be talked about a lot more than it is. You know, it's where the roots of all music came across. It's a lot of legends and classic tunes that will never die. They will always be timeless. And most importantly, with this show, it's going to be a great show basically, because we've got some brilliant people that are going to be joining us, exploring their journey, like Danny. So this is Danny Briatette. You've been doing a lot of work, haven't you?
Hi, yeah.
So just give us an insight of your influences with your music and the events that you witnessed when you first started your music career. Like, what really got you into it and what spoke to you the most?
I mean, I grew up in London. I grew up in West London, and for me, and for a lot of people like me, it was reggae. Really, growing up in like the late 70s and the 80s, that it was the sound system culture of reggae, which had a huge impact on us, and it was the music first and foremost. It was dub and it was bass. It was all about bass, and it was also the kind of lifestyle and the culture that went with it. That Jamaican people brought to this country, West Indian people brought to this country. You have the shebeen or the blues dance, which were kind of like illegal raves, really, but they could just be in someone's house. The Irish used to do it as well, like in part of the places like Kilburn and Harlesden, there'd be like, you just go in a house, some bloke's house, and they'd have a bar set up, and they'd be playing music and people drinking and dancing, and it'd be after hours and it would be illegal. But Irish music didn't have quite the same appeal to sort of kids as let's say reggae did. So, that for me, that's where it all started, was going to the sound system and feeling the bass, and also having that thrill of things being illegal and not mainstream, and the police could come and shut it down any time, and you were in a place with all sorts of dodgy characters. It was a bit edgy, and you have to watch yourself a little bit, and there weren't too many sort of white kids going to those things at the time, but gradually that started to change, because what appealed to me and people like me started to filter through into sort of initially it was just places like Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hill in London, or parts of Bristol and parts of Birmingham and Brixton, places like that where you had a big West Indian community that kind of thing was going on. But it started to branch out, and I think what happened was, people like myself, or people from my generation that have grown up in that kind of world, started to put on events in abandoned buildings, and it was kind of copying the blueprint of what the reggae sound systems had done. But it wouldn't necessarily be reggae, there'd be some, but it'd be like rare groove, funk, hip-hop. This was before house had really started, like very early house music, and it was quite eclectic, and there was people doing it here. You had like people we were talking about earlier, like Jeremy Healy, who went on to be a pop star and a kind of really mainstream DJ, but when he started, he had a thing called the Circus, and it was a very underground thing. And these kind of parties, you get people like Grandmaster Flash and these DJs from the States coming to play that would never get on anywhere else, and this would be in a kind of abandoned warehouse or something like that. And you had similar things going on in New York. They were called outlaw parties, and they were in, again, abandoned buildings or underneath the motorways, and and all kinds of weird places. And like what you got here and in New York, there was only like a few hundred people on that kind of scene. We're talking about the mid 80s, 85, 86, around about then. And you got a fantastic mixture of music, but you also got a fantastic mixture of people. So you had like a lot of these parties attracted a lot of people from the fashion scene. A lot of gay people were going there because they felt okay, but you also, because of the music, you got quite a lot of street people going as well. So you would go to one of these things, and you get like drag queens and designers and all sorts of people from that kind of world next to kind of like guys from council estates who were just bringing into the music and stuff, you know, and people started to learn about each other's kind of culture and lifestyle within a kind of completely illegal environment, you know. And that's what kind of led to the acid house thing, because that was already there, that was already going on here. I'd say mainly here in New York.
Yeah.
Is where that was going on. And so you had that kind of sort of blueprint of people breaking into buildings, setting up a sound system. I had a sound system called Metro, and we used to have buildings in all around what's now Shoreditch, which is now kind of prime real estate, like Rivington Street, Curtin Road, all those kind of places. And in the 80s, those places were abandoned. There was nobody lived there. There was no bars, there was no restaurants. There was just like a few Bangladeshi families living in the flats there, you know. But there was nobody really went there. So you could go there with a pair of bolt cutters, and you could cut the chains on these buildings, because they're all just kind of locked up and boarded up, and nobody did anything with them. They weren't considered to have any value. It was before the property boom happened in London. So the East End, and even Notting Hill, you know, a lot of places that now are like very, very expensive, like Shoreditch, like Ladbroke Grove, whatever, they were quite desolate, you know. So you go down there with some bolt cutters, you cut the chains on these buildings, you go in there, you set up a sound system. There was no internet then, so you'd have a word of mouth, kids going out with flyers, or people would just have a mailing list, and they'd let people know, and people would come, you know, and there was never any trouble, very, very rarely any trouble. Great mixture of people. And the thing that became, you know, hip hop was developing at that time as well, and hip hop hadn't really become the sort of like the mainstream music that it is now. So all of these kind of types of music that were getting played, a bit of alternative sort of indie music, you know, a lot of funk, a lot of rare groove, that was all getting played. And so there was a generation of people that were really used to going out in that format. And there was ecstasy as well. You know, people think ecstasy came in like 88 or something like that. It was around for years, but you know, it was around throughout the 80s. But again, it's a really small thing, but people were doing it. And, you know, that thing started to spread as well. And then, you know, the house thing started. And because that music, the early house music was very kind of underground, its natural place to be heard was in these kind of warehouse parties, these illegal raves that were happening around. So, you know, a lot of DJs started bringing that kind of music as well, and so it started to develop there. And that, because you couldn't hear that in sort of mainstream clubs in the beginning, do you know what I mean? Any more than you could any other sort of like, you know, alternative music. So
I mean, it almost seems as if it's like a safe haven for, you know, bringing new music to the table. It was somewhere where people could explore what they wanted, you know, their own imagination, without having the judgment. Like, it was like a tight niche subculture. You know, this is how my parents and my aunties and uncles have explained it to me, and, you know, they've had some brilliant stories, which is why it's such a passionate topic to me. You know, when I go to illegal raves with my friends, and I can still see that the spirit of illegal raves and that true rave culture still carries on throughout, and that's what makes it so brilliant, you know. Yeah, I mean, illegal raves are definitely a big part of rave culture from what I've interpreted with the stories that I've heard.
Yeah, it was a big part of it, but it was kind of like out of necessity, because you couldn't hear that music. I mean, at the time, you know, it's hard for people to understand now, because you've got so many of these clubs that are catered towards, you know, there was nothing like Fabric, there was nothing like The End has been and gone, but, you know, all of these places that you've got now that are set up to play dance music, set up for DJs, set up for electronic music, set up for alternative music, that you've got in every city in the country, you know, that didn't exist. You had the West End, which played like cheesy sort of chart music, you know, and, you know, if you didn't want to listen to that, there were a few soul clubs that played underground soul. There was a few reggae clubs that played reggae and cater for that audience. But for this kind of new electronic music that was starting to come through, there were no real proper venues for it at the time, so you had to do it yourself, you know. So that kind of came out of necessity, but with it kind of brought the atmosphere and the vibes as well, because it wasn't controlled. You didn't have bouncers in sort of black suits and stuff, searching
Right.
people, and you know, if you wanted to do something, as long as you weren't bothering anybody else,
Yeah.
no one was going to bother you, you know. And if you wanted to do whatever you might want to take or
Yeah.
do, you know, within reason, that was going to be okay.
Yeah.
And so, but what happened? I mean, for me, that time in the mid-80s was a really, really good time, because people were just experimenting, and you would hear like 5 different styles of music on the same night, even from the same DJ, you know. But then eventually it started to tighten up more, because people really wanted to hear house. So house got bigger and bigger and bigger.
Okay.
And the other things kind of got pushed out. So you might have I don't know, you might have a sort of down tempo room, which would get smaller and smaller, but the house room was getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what people really wanted to listen to, you know. And that kind of took it from being a sort of like a quite a minority thing to a mass thing, you know.
Huge mainstream
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, I've definitely noticed it. I mean, for me, I'm a techno head, but I've like every sort of event that I've either worked or been at, house is huge, and I've got a lot of friends that they much prefer house over techno or trance. You know, trance is something that's kind of fizzling out, which I didn't wish it did, but you know, it's definitely turning into, you know, a huge thing. But then again, I feel like a lot of new age DJs, they are bringing some old stuff in. You know, I think especially with, you know, with the recent passing of Keith Flint, I've seen this year with events I've been to a whole bunch of Prodigy stuff. I mean, I know that you've got definitely some of your influences was from the Prodigy as well. You know, I mean, they did some great stuff. But yeah, I mean.
Yeah, people need to just, you know, I've got a 15-year-old, you know, and yeah, for his generation, it's grime and like UK rap predominantly, you know. But I always try and explain to him that this is just another chapter in the kind of story of electronic music that started in the 70s, really, with the reggae sound systems, and moved through all of these different things. And the roots of it is it's in reggae and dub, and it's that stripped down, you know, bass line kind of music, which that flows through house, drum and bass, dubstep, you know, that's kind of that's the vibe that people took in a lot of different directions. If it wasn't for reggae, there'd be no drum and bass for sure, you know. Drum and bass is like reggae at double time, you know. But you know, and a lot of the grime artists, they don't pay any homage to sort of what went before, and that's okay, because they're young kids doing their thing. But the material that they took from, you know, like garage, drum and bass, rap, a lot of these things, it all has the same root. It all has the same root in that kind of like underground, you know, bass line driven environment, you know, and that's kind of become normal now. That's kind of what everybody listens to, whereas before it's a very minority thing, but it obviously infected everybody. So kids, I mean, the music that's in the charts now, the people like, you know, J Hus and all of these kind of like grime artists make, that would have been considered very kind of like avant-garde, you know, 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago. Now it's kind of mainstream, and it's what school kids listen to. And I think that's wicked, you know. They've just taken their take on what we did before, or what other people did before us, you know.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, I think there's a lot of different genres that are popping out and, you know, doing their own take on things. I haven't really seen, like, personally, I haven't seen too much context on, like, relating back and actually having gratification for the old school stuff. I feel like that should be, you know, that would definitely help with the whole music history itself, by announcing your appreciation for the old school things, where your inspiration essentially came from. But then again, I think a lot of like music lovers and influencers today don't really realise, like they haven't really got themselves involved with the history of it anyway. They're kind of just listening to it as and when they want to. Yeah,
I mean, people aren't so interested in the reference points as they were before. I mean, for my generation, it was really you had to go backwards to move forwards, you know. So we were looking for breakbeats, we were looking for samples, you know. So we're going out and getting loads of rubbish, crappy old records,
Yeah.
and just going through, spend endlessly going through, looking for samples, looking for breaks, looking for beats, you know, and and in doing that, you kind of became really familiar with a lot of the music from the past, you know. Whereas now, that's not really the case, because everything, you can make records on your phone if you want, and they're going to sound all right. You know, people have got really no need to kind of refer back or look to this, look to that. But that's okay. That's their thing. You know, I just think at the moment everyone's using the same tools, so everything's starting to sound a bit samey. People aren't really pushing the envelope in different directions. You know, you've got your native instruments, you've got your plugins, you've got this, that, and the other, and everyone's got access to all of that, and it all sounds great. You know, whereas before, you know, we'd spend 3 days working on a bass sound, for example. Now you just dial one up in a second and it sounds all right. You might as well just use that. There's no sense in trying to make anything new. And like, looking back to what went before, I think it's really important, because it is our culture, you know, but that culture's evolved over decades. And I think for British people, it's like we're kind of unique, you know, because we're a small country with a hugely creative people, you know, and
absolutely.
no one's ever really gone into quite why that is. I think there's different reasons for it, you know. And part some people say it's because of the weather, because the weather's bad and we have to stay indoors and do something. But it's partly that, you know, but it's partly because we accept other cultures, you know, and we take things and make them our own. That goes back to the Rolling Stones. Like they would take American blues music, which wasn't really even listened to in America, you know, by these obscure black guys from like the southern states who nobody knew who they were until the Rolling Stones brought them on tour with them. But they were the sort of blueprint for what bands like the Stones and the Who and those kind of people did. And it was like for later generations, it wouldn't be that. It will be maybe checking for reggae, checking for hip hop, checking for funk, you know, all of these, or checking for German electronic music. You know, we've always been very open to sort of like, and we take these things and then we kind of mash them up and we make them our own, and we invent new forms of music which we then sell to the rest of the world. Nobody else does that. Really, nobody does that apart from us. I mean, American music has evolved, and you could say hip hop is their kind of latest incarnation of that journey. But if you think of all the genres that we've invented in the last 30 years, UK garage, dubstep, grime, drum and bass, jungle, just goes on and on and on. You know what I mean? And that's because, and now there's all this thing with like the Indian, you know, like guys like Steel Bangles and these kind of UK born sort of kids with Indian, South Asian heritage. And before there were guys like Joy Bhangra, there was people making music with Indian influences, but now they're taking it into like a real street context, and they're bringing that in. And that's what I love about this country. You know, we're so creative and we're so good at mixing and accepting other cultures and mashing them all together and making something different. If you think of drum and bass, it's kind of like, okay, it's a bit of reggae, it's a bit of rave, it's a bit of house, it's a bit of this, a bit of that, all kind of mashed together to make something new. You know, whether you like it or not, it doesn't really matter. It's like we invented yet another form of music, you know. And I guess grime is the latest example of that. It's a bit of garage, it's a bit of hip hop, it's a bit of this, a bit of that, you know. And I think to chronicle the whole way that it's involved, like people like you are trying to do and Ernesto's always trying to do, is really important. It's just important that you do it in a way that you're not trying to sort of look down on the kids and sort of say, oh, you 16-year-olds, you don't know nothing. You know, we were there, we were from the old school. Because I don't really feel like that. It's more like, I think that it'd be really good if we could document it all. And you can hear how things have evolved, like musically, visually, in terms of society, all of these things, you know. And that it's not really being done. You get all these kind of documentaries on BBC4, but it's always about things like, they'll have a documentary about the Eagles, or they'll have a documentary about all these things that are meant to appeal to like 60-year-olds, 50, 60-year-olds, whereas really we've got this huge, rich culture here that needs to be really curated properly and documented and you know, tell the stories of how things evolved so that people can understand it. You know, and we do it all completely ourselves. I mean, you know, in this country we don't get any help from the government. You get countries like Canada and Switzerland, where the government sort of put a lot of money into the arts, even into underground music, but they've really come up with anything. Our thing all comes from sort of struggle and sort of like, you know, battling with adversity or battling against the odds. Everything comes from that, and I think that's why it's so strong. If it was easier for people here, I don't think it would be so strong. You know, it's that sort of like fight music and sort of club culture and underground culture is like a kind of way of fighting back, and it always was. You know, you've got mainstream music, which really isn't. But then even that, you know, it's like I was saying, you can go to any club in any town in this country, small towns like Stafford and places like that, they've all got a club, which back in the day wouldn't have been there, and they all and people like, you'll get guys like Dave Morales playing there once a year or something. You know, you'll get big American DJs playing there. But they've got club nights where they can go to. They play pretty mainstream dance music, but that just wasn't there before. You know, that's something that's going on. That's a business. It's an industry.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, definitely. But no, it definitely seems like it's evolving, and you know, I think this is what me and Ernesto wants to do. We want to kind of widen the history knowledge to a wider demographic. So, you know, it's going to be great to continue this show and have people like yourself to tell your story and, you know, to tell about your influences and what's going on now and you know, your take on it. So yeah, I think this project, Our History Archives, is hopefully it's gonna kick off and it's gonna become a good thing.
You're doing it in an interesting way, because Ernesto was saying, you got Mal from Cabaret Voltaire coming in and people like that, because that's kind of something that's overlooked, because the electronic music, that's another thing I didn't really mention, because you had Berlin as well in the 80s. Now Berlin, before the wall came down, that was another place I used to spend a lot of time in New York and a lot of time in Berlin, and Berlin was a very avant-garde city. You know, the country was still divided. You still had the Berlin Wall up, but West Berlin was just a little piece of the West stuck in the middle of the communist bloc, and nobody wanted to live there. They would get out if they could, but if you did live there, you didn't have to pay tax. You could get huge warehouses for free because nobody wanted the property. There's loads of bars, loads of nightclubs, loads of musicians from all over Germany and further afield would go and live and work there, and it was a unique atmosphere, and that's where electronic music really started to blossom before it turned into dance music. So you had all of this kind of really avant-garde music being made in all these really weird environments with people messing around with synthesizers and drum machine before it was really incorporated into dance music at all. You know, they were just people messing around making this mad music. You can hear that music now. If you listen to, I was in an R&B club recently, and not that I'm big into that music, but the music they were playing, I was thinking, if you took the vocals off this is like the kind of electronic music they were making in Berlin like 35 years ago, before any of this kind of turned into dance music. So there were people as well, like, you know, from my generation who were getting influenced by that electronic music, not just Kraftwerk and the kind of more obvious things like that, but there was lots of other people doing strange and wonderful things, you know, and so I'm sure Cabaret Voltaire will tell you the same thing. If they come in, you know, I'm sure there would have been, and you had labels here like Mute and these labels that we were both on, that were the sort of like promoting electronic music, which really wasn't a kind of mainstream thing, but then that fused with the funk and the reggae and all the rest of it to sort of get us to where we got in the 80s when the house music came and hip hop developed, and you know, electronic music became sort of the norm, you know, for people to listen to. Yeah,
no, definitely. But no, thank you for telling me your story and your influences and everything. You know, it's been great talking to you.
Thanks.
And you're going to do a little set for us now.
Yeah,
I think.
I'll do a little set. Yeah.
So that would be good. So keep tuned. He's going to be bringing the tunes.
Thanks a lot.
And